I tried to draw my worst nightmare for George, a vision of my worst nightmare. And he said, "Give me your second worst nightmare."
But then when he put the helmet on, you're really transported back to being 8 years old.
I think for Darth Maul, I had tried to out-helmet Darth Vader for about a year.
He is kind of, to some extent, the hero of the whole story.
And so when you put all those things together to create one of the most visually striking villains of all time.
And then John Williams comes along and puts a soul inside him.
And he turned to me really quickly, just spun his head at me in this kind of aggressive way.
I'll show you the dark side.
Imagine crafting your own wall art. Maybe it's a passion that fascinates you. Or maybe it's the promise of an immersive, creative experience like no other. A piece of iconic art you can build for yourself. Relax and reconnect with your creative side. We've created unique soundtracks, curated around the world of art, music, and movies. And in this soundtrack, we're going into the Star Wars universe. We'll hear from 4 of the people who were a big part in creating the movies that we all know and love, and take a deep dive into the Sith Lords. How do you create the next iconic supervillains to follow Darth Vader? We're also going to hear from these guys. R2-D2 and BB-8, and the sound designer that was a big part of giving them their voices. And then, we'll hear from the LEGO designers who created the LEGO art pictures of the Sith Lords, and get a peek behind the curtain of what it's like working at the LEGO Group. You can listen as you build at your own pace and get the inside story. Ready to dive in? Good, me too. I'm Andrea Collins. Welcome to LEGO Art. Our first guest is Doug Chiang. He's the Vice President and Executive Creative Director for Lucasfilm. In that job, he basically oversees all the Star Wars designs for the franchise. That can be for feature films, theme parks, video games, and long-form TV shows. When the original Star Wars movies were made, it was mostly analog. A lot of model building, analog audio production, and even stop-motion animation. Then came the computers and cutting-edge special effect creations, and Doug Chiang was right in the forefront of that. So before we go behind the scenes of the creation and design of the Star Wars universe, let's hear about that. And we start in Detroit, where a 15-year-old Taiwanese-born boy saw a movie that changed his life. Because Doug didn't always know he wanted to work in the movie industry.
I didn't. No, actually growing up as a kid in Detroit, Michigan, I always drew, and I drew a lot. And I didn't really know if there could ever be a career in art. And what changed that was when I saw Star Wars when I was 15 years old. And after seeing Star Wars, the following year, I saw the making of the documentary behind the scenes of the people actually doing the craft. And that really showed me that there were people who were doing this as a living. And I realized, well, maybe there's a way I can channel my creative energies in terms of my, my doodles in elementary school to be something that could become a career. And at that same time, I was also really interested in stop motion animation by, the films of Ray Harryhausen. And so after seeing Star Wars and after seeing the making of documentary, I realized, well, maybe there's a chance. And so I went to the library and checked out books on filmmaking, model building, set building, and animation. And I started to make my own movies. And at this time, I really didn't know where I was going to go. I was just having a lot of fun, just experimenting. And I think part of the charm and the excitement for me was that I didn't know what I was doing. It was all kind of new, and I was making it up as I went. And so I had this really weird, naive, bold confidence that kind of, drove me. And that really fueled my love for filmmaking. And I started making dozens and dozens of short 3-minute animations. And surprisingly, I entered them into film festivals and they started to win.
Wow.
Yeah, no, and that's when I realized, well, maybe there is a potential. But, growing up in Michigan, we are so far removed from California and the film industry that I honestly didn't know how I would ever, manage to get into the business itself. And so ultimately I decided that, okay, I had to move out of Michigan. I had to move to the West Coast. and I ended up studying film at UCLA.
Wow. It's so interesting when you start doing something just for fun and then years later you go, man, look at that. It actually, those experiences still come in handy, I'm sure, in some way, or that creativity.
Exactly. And that was, when I remember back when I was a child of 15 doing this, that was the allure, was, there was this boldness, this sort of fearlessness in terms of creating art, because honestly, I didn't know any better. I didn't know what the limitations were. And so that kind of youthful spark was really, something that I try to maintain and capture today, even in my day job, because I think that's so important that you can't overthink it. You just have to kind of dive in, with your full creativity and take those risks that you need, in order to do a really good job. And so what's interesting now is that, it's been, wow, almost 40 some years since then. And I still approach my job in very much the same manner, meaning that I go into each of these projects not really knowing where it's going to go. And a lot of times what excites me about the films that I design is that it's always new. It's always fresh. I'm always working with new filmmakers with a new point of view, and I don't know where it's going to go. And so that's where the excitement comes in, is that each project always pushes me out of my comfort zone. Mm-hmm. And I love that idea that, I'm 58 years old now, and I've been in this business for quite a long time, that I still find that excitement of learning something new, that I'm constantly growing. And I hope that never goes away.
In other words, it was Star Wars that got the 15-year-old Doug interested in filmmaking. So when he came out to Los Angeles, it was his biggest dream to work with George Lucas at the new Star Wars films.
But I also realized at the same time that was probably a very slim chance.
So he devoted his career at that point to just getting into the film business and started directing and designing computer-generated TV commercials. And that got him comfortable with working with computer graphics. That was very new at the time. But it was still a dream to work on real movies. So when he got offered a job at Industrial Light and Magic, a company founded by his hero, George Lucas,
I basically packed everything up and drove north.
He jumped at the opportunity.
It was a chance I had to take. It was a chance to fulfill my dream, because it was a chance to work with Industrial Light and Magic, the people behind the scenes in that making of documentary that I saw when I was 15 years old. And the irony was that when I arrived at ILM, the rumor at that time was that George was never going to make another Star Wars film. He was done. That phase of that production was done. And so I kind of resigned myself. Okay, well, I'm here at the company that he formed to do Star Wars, but I was going to really embrace the opportunity and just work on, being creative and work on designing films. And I was the new kid on the block. I was the new art director at Industrial Light and Magic. And so I didn't get all the choice projects, but I was given the projects that were in some ways the cutting edge of visual effects at that time, meaning computer graphics. And so one of the projects that I got was an opportunity to work and design the visual effects for Terminator 2.
When Terminator 2 came out back in '91, the world saw special effects we've never seen before. The movie marked the first time that a lead character in a feature film had been created, at least in part, through the use of computer graphics. Remember the villain turning into liquid metal and walking through the bars of a prison? It's regarded as a milestone in computer graphics and changed the movie industry forever.
And it was really great because, we were finally trying to push the boundaries of filmmaking. And that's, I have to say, one of the unique things that I really feel fortunate about in my career is that I've been given opportunities to work on the cutting edge of filmmaking, whether it's filmmaking techniques, filmmaking stories. And Terminator 2 was definitely one of those films where we were pushing the boundaries of visual design in terms of what could be created cinematically for film. James Cameron, had a very distinct idea of what he wanted, and it was our goal to really bring that to life. And at that time, computer graphics looked pretty good, but it wasn't photoreal. It wasn't cinematic. It didn't quite make that breakthrough yet. And so Terminator 2 was our opportunity to actually merge the two, to really prove to the film-going audience that computer graphics was at a point where it could actually, create a very powerful illusion to replace, model building and set building, to create a completely synthetic creature and character.
You've probably seen so much change in the special effects world over the decades.
Yes. No, and that's the interesting thing is I was very fortunate in my career to actually, come into the industry at that bridge, at that transition of, going from traditional media in terms of model building and practical sets and stage building miniatures to the new realm of all digital visual effects. And what was fascinating for me was, it was a new tool. It was something that was very special. A lot of people didn't understand how it worked. And I think that was the power for me, the attraction for me was to dive into this new technique and to really push it to discover what it could do and what it couldn't do.
In 92, you and the special effects team at ILM won both a BAFTA and an Academy Award for Best Visual Effects on Death Becomes Her. What was that like?
Oh, it was completely surreal. I mean, that's one of those things where you hope and aspire that you can achieve something like this in your career, but I never really thought it would be realistic. And to have the opportunity to be even nominated was something very special. And the funny thing is, when we were working on these films, we knew we were always on the cutting edge, and that's part of the appeal of why Industrial Light and Magic were doing these kinds of films, is that very few companies at that time could do this kind of visual effects. And for Death Becomes Her, it was very unique in that this was the first film where we were really trying to create organic synthetic humans in terms of flesh, in terms of how to do these weird sort of distorted figures, because of course Death Becomes Her is a Black comedy, and our main heroes basically take this immortality potion that allows them to live forever, and that means that they can't die even if they're injured. And throughout the film, you see them in those various stages where Meryl Streep, for instance, had her head completely twisted around. And how do you do that? How do you create a visual effect of that? And part of the solution was to create a digital neck that we can blend her head to her body, but reattach it in a very unusual way. And so Death Becomes Her was a breakthrough in that this was the first time we were using computer graphics to actually create synthetic, organic tissue. And it was a really hard task. I remember we went in there, and even though there were only a handful of shots, it took months and months to do. And then even on top of that, we had to go in there and by hand, hand paint the visual effects to clean up what the computers couldn't do. And what was really great was that, it was proving that, okay, as a tool, computer graphics had the potential to actually now move forward into sort of the organic territory. And so when Death Becomes Her was nominated for an Academy Award, I mean, we were kind of all blown away because, of course, being in the visual effects community, we knew that this was going to be something special. We knew we were creating things that people had never seen before. But again, we didn't know, how far we were really pushing the technology. And the visual effects community is wonderful in the sense that they, we thrive on pushing the boundaries of filmmaking. And to be recognized by the Academy for that, for Death Becomes Her, was just icing on top of the cake. And I remember, I was, I believe, about 31 years old. It was completely surreal. I mean, it was kind of the pinnacle of my career at that time, and I didn't know where it was going to go after that. But it was just kind of an amazing experience to be recognized by your peers.
At ILM up through the early 90s, Doug Chiang worked on more iconic movies after that. Forrest Gump, The Mask, Jumanji.
And so I was right at ILM at that point where we were trying to discover, okay, well, how far should we push this medium? Is this really viable? And how much can we use of it for visual effects?
So whenever he had a meeting with a director or someone else from one of the studios, they always asked for the same thing.
Show me something that we haven't seen before. Show me something that has never been done before.
Oh my God.
And that's a really hard ask because, it's like, okay, well, what is that? If you haven't seen it, what is it? And that was the fun charm, is that the pendulum in terms of the visual spectacle swung all the way to the very far extreme where we were tasked to design things that were just, completely out of the imagination, to really just kind of invent spectacle for the storytelling. And that was really fun. But as once that allure of creating spectacle kind of goes its full course, you then start to realize, well, you know what, you're just creating eye candy. There's very little substance to this visual spectacle. We have to pull it back to reality. We have to pull it back to the story. We have to make sure that the tools and how we're using computer graphics actually serves the filmmaker and the storytelling part of it. And so now I'm seeing an interesting flow where the pendulum is swinging back the other way, where it's going back more towards old school, more traditional techniques. And so what I love about where we are is that we are at that point in the filmmaking industry where the technique now is just that. It's a tool for us to use. And our goal is to use all of that in designing, a powerfully entertaining story.
And sometimes you do special effects that we don't even see as effects.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes. No, exactly. No, and it's a good point to bring up is that a lot of times visual effects is not about visual spectacle. Sometimes it can be very subtle. And one of the reasons I enjoyed working with Robert Zemeckis on Forrest Gump was that 80% of the visual effects were completely invisible. I mean, a lot of times people don't even know what we were doing. We were doing things like manipulating clouds, manipulating the sky, manipulating nature in such a very subtle way to sort of accentuate the key emotional points of the story at that time. And so when you look at the film, everything is very carefully art directed, even though it looks like, wow, we just, went out there and shot a beautiful plate or beautiful background. But in fact, the clouds were, artificially put in there to be very specific, to tell a very, emotional scene. And in some ways, that's where I think the power of visual effects is most powerful, is that audiences don't realize it. They don't see it. They don't recognize it. They just get immersed into the story. The other extreme, of course, is the spectacle of, creating space battles and laser guns and stuff. But I like both. I like the very subtle visual effects and I like the over-the-top visual effects.
In case you're wondering when we're going to hear about Star Wars and the Sith Lords, don't worry. We'll get to the dark side very soon. Later, we'll hear from the concept directors who created Darth Maul and Kylo Ren, the supervising sound editor who played a big part in creating the amazing sound of the movies, and the 2 Lego designers who recreated the Sith Lords in Lego art. Stay with us. You gotta remember that the original 3 Star Wars movies were made in the late 70s and early 80s, so long before computer graphics became so advanced as what Doug and his colleagues at ILM were doing in the 90s. Star Wars was the trigger that inspired Doug Chiang to get into filmmaking, and it was still his dream to work with George Lucas on the new Star Wars movies. All his talent and hard work finally paid off when in 1995, Lucas decided to move forward with the Star Wars universe and asked Doug to head up the new arts department.
Yeah. I was one of the first employees that was brought on board. I mean, it was myself, the producer, and George. And it was really great because, that first year and a half was just pure creativity, pure blue sky. I didn't know what George was writing. He would only give me tiny little tidbits of stories, of characters, of things that he wanted to explore. And that was very deliberate. I mean, he specifically wanted me to not know enough of the story so I could then explore and develop these worlds as full worlds. By that meaning that, when I was, for instance, designing the planet of Naboo, his brief was that, this is a new planet. It's a very idyllic planet. This is sort of a very old culture. It's kind of, like Venice in some ways. It's a mix of different architectural styles. And from there, he let me run with it.
Let me just pause here for a second to let that sink in. Imagine your boss coming into your office and saying, I need you to design a planet. Let's call it Naboo. Yes, that's it. The planet Naboo. Go ahead. That's what happened. And that's what Doug did.
And that's one of the great things is that then I can go in there using research. I can start to flesh out what the world can be, what it can look like. Things, all the way down to, what is the set dressing in a room? What are the vehicles like? What is the architectural style? What is the costuming? What are the characters? What are the creatures that inhabit this world? And this was all independent of knowing how they would all be, woven into George's story. And then once I had enough of that laid out there, then George could come in and literally just cherry pick the ideas that he wanted. And by doing that, it was one of the really great things about working with George is that I learned so much about film design. Prior to joining the Lucasfilm art department in 95, I had a pretty solid 9 years of film design, and I thought I was pretty good at it. But when I started working with George, I realized that, he was a true visionary in the sense that he knew how to build worlds to make them feel very authentic, very real. And that's critical because that's why Star Wars is so timeless now. All designs hold up really well. And they hold up because George's approach was really unique. He never considered Star Wars to be science fantasy. He always considered it to be a documentary, a historical film, a period piece. And that was how we designed it, was that instead of designing a future world, we went back into the past and designed it as a real breathing world that could actually exist. And that meant doing all the homework. And so George's approach to it was really unique for me in the sense that we designed this very thorough world, and he would come in there and just cherry pick the last, maybe 2 or 5% of the world that he wanted to show on the screen. But all that rest of the homework was there, so that when you see a set on Naboo or the vehicle, all the history in terms of the development of how the designs became what they are is there. And I can explain all of that, but we don't have to. And what that gives the filmmaker is, it gives the filmmaker the ability to create something that's very authentic in the sense that everything is cohesive. The designs make sense. There's nothing very arbitrary about it. If you look at the door shapes, they make sense because of all that homework that we did. And a lot of times the audience may never care or may not want to know, but it's always there. And I think audiences are smart in the sense that they can intuitively pick that up. They know if something, feels real or if it's not, or if it's too false or if it's too fabricated.
One of the first things Doug also did was to design the pod racers in Star Wars Episode 1. And we'll hear more from Doug about that work later. And also the man who gave them the iconic sound. As you can hear, designing a planet is a bit of a mouthful, and soon, more designers joined the art department at Skywalker Ranch. One of them was the talented creature and concept designer, Terrell Whitlatch. She designed most of the alien characters and creatures for Episode 1, including the undersea monsters of Naboo, the Naboo swamp creatures, and Jar Jar Binks. Like Doug said, the first year was just
pure creativity, pure blue sky.
So there they were, drawing away. Creatures, characters, vehicles, robots, architectures, and other parts of the planet Naboo. But there was so much more to do. So they hired our next guest, talented illustrator and concept designer, Ian McKeag.
When I joined the team on Star Wars, Doug Chiang and Terrell Whitlatch had been working for, I think, almost a year. So the room up at Skywalker Ranch, the art department, was full of pictures of the best creatures, the most amazing creatures you could ever imagine, and all these robots and worlds. And I wondered, what am I going to do? And then I realized that they weren't really drawing the humans, who just happened to be the main characters. So I said, do you mind if I take these? And they went, no, take them. So by default, I kind of got all the main characters in the movie. That's manna from heaven for me. I have things about people that fascinate me, and Star Wars is a fantastic piece of mythology, which means it really goes into the archetypes of what motivates human beings. And I got a wonderful tapestry of characters to play with, not just good and evil, but every shade in between.
Where do you get your inspiration from? When do your ideas come to you?
Oh, every second of the day. Real life. Real life is my inspiration first and always. You can't beat nature for a design. You can't find better fantasy creatures than human beings. It really is. This is an amazing planet, an amazing life. And you just need to keep your eyes open and be questioning. And I think be a child as well.
But you also designed a character that definitely wasn't for children?
Oh, yes. Darth Maul was a fascinating evil character because, as Ray Parks, who played Darth Maul, said, he's not evil, he's cheeky. And I thought, cheeky? Yeah, he really is, isn't he? He's not thundering around with scowls on his face. He's actually there at the end of the film. He doesn't care about the trade wars. He just sees two Jedis, both of whom are taller than him, and he just wants to kick their butts. And he's practically hopping up and down on his feet because he can't wait to fight them.
Right. Cheeky evil is probably the most fun kind of evil.
Totally. So if you remember the Heath Ledger Joker, that was cheeky evil.
Oh, yeah.
Right? There was a character he was promoting chaos, and yet we loved him.
Uh-huh.
And he's saying terrible things, and he's doing terrible things, but we still loved him. And really, that's the hub of great design right there, is a character who can be two things at once. Life is about great paradoxes. And yes, we got to weave that inside of Darth Maul too.
This was at the time where they were doing the first of the prequels, following the original movies where Darth Vader was the villain, probably the most iconic villain in movie history. How do you possibly follow that?
I think for Darth Maul, I had tried to out-helmet Darth Vader for about a year and nearly had a nervous breakdown because, it's a perfect design. It's a skull and a Nazi helmet, and somehow that's just so iconic. I think also for me, though, it removed the face, and I couldn't see what was going on in there. And I find that terrifying when I don't know what people are thinking. So after about a year, I took the helmet off and I started to explore what would have been inside it. And that helped me a lot.
Was there a big pressure to follow that legacy to make the next iconic villain?
Well, probably. You don't think of those things when you're drawing, though. Can you imagine if you were supposed to perform that character and inside you're thinking, oh my God, this has to be the next big thing? You probably wouldn't do very well. So for me, you take all of that and you put it aside and you actually get into the story. And this particular point was, we have someone we have to be afraid of. How the heck do we do that when he's fighting 2-on-1, when he's not the main villain taking over the universe? What is it about him that's terrifying? And it was his joy in destruction. His joy in being Darth Maul.
Wow. So you work on a character like Darth Maul before you know the full story.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Very often, not just for George, but on many films, I'll come in before there's a script or sometimes even a director. There's an idea. And my job, that's why it's called concept art, is to show people what the film could be.
Wow.
And to give their writers and directors and studios and all the other department heads a vision of where they could go. George doesn't give a lot of direction. It's one of the beauties of the ways he works, is he actually casts you to do what you do and then gives you a name, a sentence. In Darth Maul's case, I think it was, he's Darth Maul, vision from your worst nightmare. Yeah, that was it. I didn't know if it was male or female or a plant or what, but it was a vision from my worst nightmare. I tried to draw my worst nightmare for George, a vision of my worst nightmare. And I put it in a little folder and I waited till the meeting and then slipped it across to him. He opened the folder and went, oh my God. And he closed it real quick and handed it back to me. And he said, give me your second worst nightmare. And then it occurred to me, it's not science fiction. It's not set in the future. When does it take place? It takes place a long, long time ago. And he didn't want my worst real life nightmare. He wanted my worst mythological nightmare. And that was easy. I have been terrified since the age of 3 of clowns. I love clowns, by the way. I've been a clown. I love clowning and all that. But anybody who paints the smile on their face is scary. Mm-hmm. So I just decided to paint the smile on Darth Maul's face. If you look carefully, he is smiling.
These characters must stick with you.
Oh, yes.
You must really feel like you probably have to embody them a little bit when you're creating this universe.
Well, I'd never draw a character from a generic face, ever, ever, ever. Characters come from the personality inside. And so, but I actually had to go around the art department and draw everybody's face and turn them into Sith Lords. Because I knew what they were, and I could imagine what they did in their dark days if they had gone to the dark side. And I think I took the animatics supervisor and I put a circuit board on his face. That's right. And then I took the photographer and I carved his face up like a pumpkin and put a light inside it. And then the production designer, Gavin, came along, and he was very hesitant to have me draw him. He just said, "Don't make me look fat." So I covered his face in these markings that, as you do when you put makeup on. There's ways to slim down a face or widen a face and so on. And all of a sudden, I think we hit it. I saw George's eyes light up, and I realized, oh, okay, he's painting his face. Of course he's painting his face. He's still wearing a mask. And I'd run out of people, so I drew myself.
So in the early stages, Ian McCaig used his own face to design Darth Maul. But then they cast Scottish actor and martial artist Ray Parks to play the role, and that added so much.
Ray has a much more interesting bone structure and a really fascinating nose that held that design much better than mine did. So just his physiognomy added so much. But so did his joy. So did his performance. That turned that design into something even better.
Oh, Darth Maul. Darth Maul is one of my favorites.
This is Doug Chiang again.
What I like about him is that it's, not only did Ray Parks bring so much to his persona, his character performance, but just the makeup and the design of the character was very unique. They're very subtle hints of a lot of things that kind of help to inform who this character is in terms of, the threat and the menace. And I think he's one of the most perfect blends of all these things, because he has a little bit of, poisonous snake graphics in there in terms of the tattoos of his face. But then Ian McCaig also gave him horns, very subtle horns that kind of remind you of the devil. And so by completely packaging all that with Ray Park's performance, his grimace, along with the tattoos, along with the iconography of the subtle horns, kind of creates a very interesting, different character that, his face is a mask. He doesn't have to hide behind anything else. And I really enjoy that, because his character is one of many different species, but Darth Maul is unique in that he's the most incredible looking character of his species.
Doug mentioned Darth Maul's horns, but that wasn't actually Ian's design. It was the result of teamwork and a misunderstanding.
I had drawn Darth Maul with these stiffened black feathers on his head. And that came from me needing to figure out a goofy reason why he would be so evil and bad-tempered and mischievous. So I bound his head with piano wire and put those black feathers, and they had to be at exactly the right place, because if not, he had to do it again, and it hurt every time. And I knew that wasn't going to be in the movie, but it gave me a good motive for putting that expression on his face.
Yeah.
So when that drawing went over to Nick Dudman, who created the horns on Darth Maul's head, he looked at my stiffened black feathers and just assumed they were dark horns, and he lightened them up and turned them into Darth Maul's horns. So that did not come from me. That came from Nick Dudman and his team.
Wow. So now we have Ian's second worst nightmare. We got the design, we got the face painting, the actor, and the horns.
And then John Williams comes along and puts a soul inside him. And when I heard it, I suddenly saw the other half of Darth Maul. And it was amazing to watch that last piece fit in there, and suddenly it came to life.
Oh gosh, yeah, John Williams, what an incredible contributor to the Star Wars franchise.
And the importance of the music and the sound is what our next guest can talk much more about. His name is Matthew Wood, and he's the supervising sound editor at Skywalker Sound.
Just amazing, and obviously a huge talent in its own right, in all the films he's done, but my involvement with him has been on the Star Wars films primarily, and he's just such a lovely man, and so collaborative and kind and gentle and creative. And he had a great rapport with George Lucas. So, those just amazing themes that he's created, just incredible themes for each character, and how he builds upon them in each movie and transposes them in different ways to create sort of a dark version of a good theme, and how everything's connected, and it's emotionally and connected inside you and you don't even know it. You can do hyper analysis of his work, and see how it's all connected on a technical level too. So yeah, his music comes into us in the final mix process. So while we're doing that time where we're all in the big movie theater sized room mixing it is where we get the final versions of his soundtrack, and we balance that against everything else in the film. And it's, we take a large step back to just appreciate what he's brought to us and his themes. Several times on the Star Wars saga, I've got to go into either at Abbey Road or at Sony Studios in Los Angeles and sat in on the orchestra and been with them while they've played, and sat in the room unamplified and listened to the orchestra play. And it's breathtaking just to hear those themes and to watch him conduct and to be part of that, and to know that we're going to contribute to that same soundtrack together is really humbling. One incredible thing that I never knew when I went, his orchestra that he works with, they sit down for the first time when they're going to play these tracks, and they get the music that day and they play it that day for the very first time. And they're all in synchronization together. You've got 100+ piece orchestra that are so professional, incredible artists, meticulously detail oriented. They can sit down and play the Star Wars music all together in synchronization with each other in perfect pitch right there. They just sit down and do it. There's no rehearsal. It's just boom, go. And I've always been just amazed at their incredible dedication to their craft to be able to do that. I was blown away.
Much more from Matthew Wood in a bit. Also coming up, concept designer Glyn Dillon, who created another of the iconic Sith villains, Kylo Ren. And then, we'll hear from the LEGO designers Kit Kosman and Christopher Stamp about the work that went into designing the LEGO art that you might be working on right now as you're listening. Stay with us. Matthew Wood is the supervising sound editor at Skywalker Sound, which is a division of Lucasfilm and Disney. He's also a voice actor for the Star Wars franchise. He's acted in the Star Wars prequels, a lot of the animation projects they've done, and the sequels. He's been working for Skywalker Sound and Lucasfilm for over 30 years, but he didn't start working on sound design. Instead, his first job was a video game tester, and that must have been a dream job for a 17-year-old.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I started, 1990. I was 17 years old, and my first job was I was hired to be a video games tester. So my job was to come in during the summer. This is right after high school. I was coming in and testing video games. So I'd have to play them all day and find faults with them and sort of log those bugs and get that information to the programmers on what to fix. And so we were called the test pit, and it was a big group of us in this one room just playing video games all day, and it was a complete dream job. Yeah, I was there first thing in the morning, and they literally had to open the building for me to get inside because I was just so excited to go to work at Lucasfilm. Yeah.
How cool is that? And so you play video games for 8 hours a day?
Yeah, it was 8 hours a day of sitting down and playing through video games. Like one of the first ones I played was The Secret of Monkey Island, which was an amazing, fun adventure game. And so I just have to play that all day. And I made some friends there, and I really enjoyed it. We were at Skywalker Ranch, this beautiful location in Marin County, California. And it was a complete dream job.
After about a year, there was an opening in the sound division. This was in the early days of digital sound editing, and George Lucas, being George Lucas, he wanted to create his own system called SoundDroid that was geared towards films.
And most computer-based editing and work like that at that time was done for music. So this is one of the first things out of the gate. So we were developing it at Lucasfilm, and it was for George to make more Star Wars movies, and so he wanted to have the technology in place for him to get ready to make these new movies. So he called over to the games division and asked for their best video games tester to come in, and he just wanted a kid to come in and hammer on his SoundDroid program to see if they could break it and try to, find new ways to fix it. And so that's what I did. I came in and I worked on that.
Matthew knew a lot about computers and had interest in sound, but there was a lot to learn about sound design.
Yeah, there was a lot to learn as you go. I didn't know much about sound design. I mean, I knew about who Ben Burtt was, who was the sort of master of all Star Wars and Indiana Jones sound design in the 70s and 80s. And he became a friend of mine out there and really wanted to learn digital technology. So I had something to offer him, as well as he had something to offer me back, which was teaching me the artistry of sound and what sound means for film and sound design. And meeting Ben Burtt kind of changed my life.
When you have a legend like Ben Burtt as your mentor, you almost can't go wrong. He did the sound design on E.T., Indiana Jones, and the original Star Wars trilogy, where he created many of the iconic sound effects, including the voice of R2-D2. The lightsaber hum, Chewbacca's voice, and of course, the heavy breathing sound of Darth Vader.
And those kind of things were the really important, milestones for me. Were meeting Ben and forming this team with him and building a team together to make movies. And so it was a very exciting and formative time for me at Lucasfilm.
What can you tell us about the iconic sound of the lightsaber and how it began and then how it's evolved?
Yeah, well, the lightsaber is a great thing. I mean, that's a classic Ben Burtt sound. He basically put sound design on the map. Because of that first Star Wars movie having so many iconic moments, he was actually given a special Oscar award that year in the Academy. They never had an Oscar to sort of for sound design, and he got a special award that year. But he had, the great thing he had was George Lucas gave him a lot of time to be able to create these things for the original Star Wars. And the lightsaber is a bunch of different components, and some of which we tried to recreate in the sequels for the new lightsabers. But it's the ignite, the sound when it ignites. Part of that is pulling on a vest, a safety vest, where like the kind they give you on an airplane when they say you're going to have a water landing. That you pull on the cord and the vest will ignite or inflate. So that little sound when it inflates, that's part of the ignite. There's also there was a great sound, the arc light that sparks when a projector light goes on in a film projector. Like the one that Ben had at USC Film School had a very intense sound when the arc light would go on, and that was part of it.
Let's just hear a few of those elements. Here's the sound of the safety vest inflating. And here's the projector light. Put that together, maybe add a few more plus a bit of magic, and you've got Luke Skywalker's lightsaber.
And then one day, Ben Burtt was taking his microphone in his apartment where he was, and it was across the room from him, and he was pulling it towards him when it was still on, and it passed behind his television set. And back then, TVs were a different kind of situation. They were these big, firing a lot of electrons into a television and these big glass monitors, and it had a lot of sort of interference from the television on the microphone. It made this like vroom sound like that. And so he ended up making that sound and turning it into like a loop of kind of just the sound of woo. And that sound played back over a speaker. Then Ben took another microphone and would wave it in front of that sound and re-record it again, and it made what's called a Doppler effect. So, like when you hear a train go by and it goes ding 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 ding, like that when you hear something pass by. So he would pass the microphone by this speaker and make this boom 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 sound, and he would perform those sounds based on how the actor was performing on screen. So that became part of the movement. And then the clashes were a lot of some classic electric sounds that Ben liked from some historical films that he was a fan of. And then he recorded some of the original devices that were used to make Frankenstein's laboratory. A lot of the Universal horror films had these electric Strickfaden sort of arcing sounds, and he went and found those original props and re-recorded them again. So there was a lot of components that went into creating those iconic lightsaber sounds. And then later on in the sequels, we went and tried to recreate some of that. And like for Kylo Ren's lightsaber, which was supposed to be very unstable and created sort of outside of the Jedi Order, it was created outside of the Jedi Order to be, by Kylo. So we put the sounds actually of a cat purring. One of his cat, he made. We put the sounds of his cat in there, and we put some sounds of engines, chainsaw. I mean, JJ wanted something like really throaty, like a Harley Davidson. So there's all kinds of things mixed in there to make it have this very imposing and unstable feel.
Wow, that's such ear candy.
Yeah.
So let's hear the unstable sound of Kylo Ren's lightsaber. See how many of the sounds you can spot? And here's what it sounded like in the movie. Wow, all the sounds that go into creating a scene like that. I'll have to go back and rewatch it now that I know there's a chainsaw, a safety vest, a cat purring in there. I bet you watch movies differently than the rest of us, knowing what you know.
I mean, yeah, sound is this wonderful thing where, you don't see it on the screen, you're feeling it. It's highly emotional, and it has this sort of secret way to get into the back door of your consciousness to tell a story, and that's what we're trying to achieve in sound. So, only if the sound is done badly do I really notice it. But I mean, 9 times out of 10, it's like I allow the story to take me away, and I'll always be a huge film fan. So going into a movie theater and having the lights go down and having it go dark and see this giant image on the screen and hear the lovely sound is usually can take me away, and I don't sit there and technically go through the whole thing. So I'm still transported and completely have a romanticized view of filmmaking and love it as a viewer as well. So I can still enjoy movies quite well.
What's something that we should all notice a bit more in a movie, though? I mean, like what comes into sound that we might not realize when there's a big explosion or there's a big fight?
When they shoot a movie, the sound recordist that's on the film, his main goal is to point these very directional microphones at the actors' mouths and record what's coming out of their mouths as the dialogue. So that's the main goal of a sound recordist on the set. But when it comes to us, then we're responsible in the post-production and sound design and team to come up with everything else. So the environments you hear, the aliens, the vehicles, the weapons, all those things, even down to the sound of what Kylo Ren's footsteps are, or Darth Vader's cape, or any of even the little teeny sounds of Han Solo's blaster on his hilt, and all those things. Everything has to be created in post-production. So we spent a good year doing that to create an experience that's supposed to feel real to you from in these alien worlds and these fictitious places that don't exist. So we're creating those places in post-production and sound.
What about R2-D2 and all of his wonderful sounds?
Yeah, R2-D2, amazing sound. He is based on half performance and half technology. There's a synthesizer called the ARP, the ARP 2600, and it's an analog synth, one of the early ones. And so Ben Burt had that, and he was able to have oscillators and frequencies trigger to his vocal performance. So Ben would take the microphone and do stuff like "Ooh, doo, 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 doo," like or like "woo, woo, woo," and like kind of make sounds and "ha ha ha," and the oscillators and frequencies would track with his voice. And he created all these emotions. And it's funny because he tried to treat R2 like it was a script, like, C-3PO and whoever the characters are that were interacting with him, he wrote English lines for, and then he kind of performed them with this voice and had that synthesized through the ARP. And that became R2. And, we had a challenge on, because he made such an amazing droid with R2-D2. It had all the responses you need. It had sad and angry and frustrated and happy and excited and worried, and he'd made all those sounds that were so iconic and brilliant. So then when we came up to having to make BB-8 and the sequels, we wanted, and we knew BB-8 and R2 were going to have to interact, and we wanted them to have a very distinct sound for each other. We had to come up with yet again a second version of another droid that could have all those emotions but also be different than R2. So we used a lot of synthesis as well, using a synthesizer, but had it be tactily controlled with our hand on a grid, and so we could influence the way the performance was going to be based on drawing lines with our fingers.
Wow. Now that we've heard the difference between the two droids, let's hear a discussion between them. To simplify it a bit, the production process of a movie can be broken up into 3 parts. Pre-production, that's where they design and plan everything, the shooting of the movie, and then post-production.
Post-production, which is the division that I work in, the visual effects and the music and the editing and everything that takes place after shooting in the post is a huge part of it. And so I was working on the Star Wars prequels for over a year at least on each one, just building these worlds.
What's unusual for the way George Lucas worked with the prequels, as you already heard Doug Chiang and Ian McKeag talk about, was that he brought a lot of them in before there was even a script. And that was the same with Matthew Wood and the sound team.
The first big Star Wars film I did was Phantom Menace, Episode 1. And that had this sequence called the pod race, where Anakin is racing against all these other competitors against Sebulba and all these other creatures. And so George Lucas really wanted each pod to have a very distinct personality that kind of matched the driver. And so we had to go out and just record all over the place. So that was a moment where we could start acquiring the sounds even before shooting had commenced.
Let's go back to Doug Chiang, because the pod racers were also one of the first things he worked on when he joined Lucasfilm.
Yes, the pod racer is one of the most fun design challenges. And I remember in my very first meeting with George, after I was hired to head up the art department, I was in his office. And at first I thought it was just a meet and greet, that I would finally get to meet him. Because at that time, I only saw him in hallways at ILM and never really spoke to him. And so this was my chance. And I was just starstruck. And I remember we were going, in there, it was myself and Tara Whitlatch, along with the producer, Rick McCallum. And we were in George's office and we sat down. And he basically just started to talk about the ideas that he had. And I was completely unprepared. I didn't realize, he was going to give us a design brief. So I had to go and grab all the napkins that I could on the table and just started writing down notes as much as I could, as fast as I could. And one of the first things that he described was this new race that he wanted to invent. And he said, basically, the idea is take 2 of the most powerful engines that rocket engines, jet engines, and just strap a cockpit to it. And that's going to become our vehicle. And when I heard that, I was really excited because I could visually see that in my mind. I could see where he was going with it. And it was very simple. I mean, it distills the concept down to its bare essence, which is basically a powerful engine and a cockpit and a pilot. That's all you do.
So, in other words, at that first meeting with George Lucas, Doug was listening to what he said, scribbling down on napkins. And then he tried to put his designer's hat on.
And so I started to design, what I thought it should be with, all those things in mind, tying the engines together, putting an enclosed cockpit on there to protect the pilot.
These designs looked pretty cool. But then he showed them to George.
when I first showed those designs to George said, no, that's not quite what I wanted. And he, again, described exactly what he said in the first meeting, which was take 2 engines, put a cockpit to it. And I chased this for a while. And I realized, okay, no, I was thinking too rationally. I should just think like a kid again and just literally, do what he asked, what George was asking. And that was literally just take 2 engines, don't tether them together, and put this very flimsy cockpit on there. And part of what it was that in George's mind, he already had an idea of what he wanted, and he wanted the danger. That was the whole reason why he wanted these giant engines with this very exposed cockpit, was that this was supposed to be a very dangerous race. And that was to prove that, Anakin, by being a young kid, that he could pilot this better than anybody else, really kind of reinforced his character. And so I got that then at that time, and I started to design, turning off my logical brain and just embracing the idea to reinforce what the character is.
So the pod racers had to look dangerous as a part of describing the character of the young boy Anakin Skywalker, who later grew up to become Darth Vader. And that's what Doug started drawing after turning off his logical brain. But at the same time, research is important.
I did a research trip to the San Francisco airport, into the maintenance bay of one of the airliners. And we were given special access to go behind the scenes to see how they service these jet engines. And I remember I walked into the service bays, these garages, and they had these giant jet engines hung on these cranes, and they're all lined up almost exactly like pod racers. And it was so amazing. I just realized, well, there's very little you need to do to make this very special. All you have to do is take this raw engine and just tie a cockpit to it. And that's exactly what I did. And those were the first images that George really started to like for the pod race.
The design of the pod racers was starting to take shape, but they also had to have a unique, distinct sound. So let's go back to Matthew Wood from Skywalker Sound. Matthew, can you tell us how you did that?
Yeah, I mean, as a sound recordist or a designer, you're always carrying a recorder with you. And if you hear something interesting somewhere, you'll record it and log it for use at a later time. Specifically for the pod race, I mean, one of the main things was, let's just go get as many different engines as we can. And so I remember going out and recording a really vintage Ferrari, and the owner of the vehicle took the muffler off for me, so it would just be like super loud. And a lot of that became what Anakin's pod, Anakin Skywalker's pod, his revving. And then I went out to a racetrack in Northern California where it was like a, bring your own car kind of racetrack, and you just paint a number on the side of your vehicle and you could go out and drive, and there was all these different cars with souped up engines. And I remember recording all those, and this one Porsche had this really high whine to it, and that became part of Anakin's pod. And then Sebulba was a lot of, I went out and recorded this little cigarette jet boat out in the San Francisco Bay, and that became Sebulba.
Do those people know that their boat has become that?
Probably not. I mean, I do, we obviously have, we ask people to participate in the filmmaking process, but sometimes you never know where it's going to be added to. Like, I'll record it and we'll bring it back to the studio and it'll end up working for this or that. So,
right.
But yeah, that's a funny thing. If I ever went back and told somebody, I to find them and say that was Sebulba's pod, your boat, Yeah.
How cool would that be? Yeah.
That'd be amazing. Yeah.
I think it's about time we hear what we're talking about. This is Sebulba's pod racer. Here comes young Anakin. And the race is on. Doug, did you have sounds like these in mind when you were creating the design?
I did. And the funny thing, when I'm designing, I do kind of play in my mind, what I feel like it should be, either the creatures are saying or the power of the sound, and it's kind of, it goes back to my childhood. When you're drawing a spaceship, you kind of make, spaceship noises. And so doing the pod engines, I thought, okay, well, they're jet engines. They should be like, they should sound like jet engines. And so that was my initial thinking. And I remember George surprised me when he said, think of them more as F1 cars. And that's, in fact, what we're going to do with the sound design, that they're going to sound like F1 cars, not jet engines. And I thought, whoa, wait a minute. Okay, that's really interesting because now you're kind of mixing two different ideas. And it was actually the exact, the absolute right mix of ingredients, because here you're taking visually something that's very distinct, a jet engine. And you would think, okay, well, I should make jet engine noises. But no, we're going to turn this into a racing car. We're going to have F1 engines in there as the sound. And by merging the two, it's what George does so brilliantly, is that he can combine different things to create something even better. And he does that visually. He does that with sound. He does that with characters. He does that with, with everything really in terms of the worlds that he's creating. And so this was one of those examples where at first I didn't quite know, okay, can an F1, engine really sound right when you see this pod racer? And I remember Ben Burtt in the early days, as he was cutting the previous animatics together with the early designs, he started throwing in there F1 car sounds. And I have to say, I mean, it gave me goosebumps because it elevated the pod race to something that was completely unexpected for me.
We'll get back to Doug and Matthew later in the soundtrack. Now, we're bringing in the British concept designer Glyn Dillon to hear how he created the Kylo Ren character. But first, let's talk about the biggest villain of them all. And obviously, one of the 3 Siths that's in the Lego art set.
Probably the most iconic cinema villain in cinema history. Very powerful image, it's a very iconic image.
We're, of course, talking about Darth Vader. And Glyn was around 8 years old when he saw him for the first time on the silver screen. And then he got to see him again up close when he was part of the design team doing Rogue One. So Glyn was asked to recreate the iconic mask and the cape. He'd been working on that for a long time.
We're in the fitting with this very tall stunt guy who's going to be playing him.
And then when they had to dress up the stuntman, something weird happened.
Chatting away as you do in a fitting. Before he's got the helmet on, before he's got the cape on, he has to wear the leather undersuit, and we're all just working away, chatting away. But then when he put the cape on, and then when we put the helmet on, there was a moment where it sounds funny, but it's like you're really transported back to being 8 years old, where you're not really seeing what's in front of you. You're seeing what was in your mind's eye when you were a child. It was a really strange kind of effect that it had. And it was almost one of those things where you have to kind of snap out of it in order to then bring your kind of editorial brain back to the job in hand to make sure things were fitting right and the chain around the neck was right and that kind of thing. But it was really funny. It was a very powerful experience to go back to that time, that time being confronted by Darth Vader. It wasn't very eloquent. It was just freaking out,
That wasn't the only time Glyn Dillon was scared by his own design, but we'll get back to that. Let's hear what Doug Chiang has to say about the design of Darth Vader.
Yeah, Darth Vader is one of the most iconic villains for me, and it's just because of that mask. And and that mask, there's a reason for it, and that's the curious thing is that when I first saw it when I was 15, I thought, oh, it's just a cool mask. I didn't realize there was a logic behind that. And then later on, when I finally got to meet and know Ralph McQuarrie, he explained that when he designed Darth Vader's mask, that he thought that Darth Vader would actually go out into space. So it was actually a space mask. It was actually a breather. It was a spacesuit, and so that completely made sense. That ties into why his head is enclosed. But then to carry that even further, you learn more about the backstory of Darth Vader. That this his outfit is actually a life support system, that it helps sustain him as well. But then on top of that, what Ralph brought to it that made it even more perfect was that he gave it a emotional sort of iconic look, and that was basically a very stylized looking skull, a black skull, merging it a little bit with some samurai helmet influences. And what Ralph was doing at the early days was exactly what George, likes to do for all designs. He likes to combine different cultures and then imbue it with a very strong, iconic, emotional graphic that anchors the whole thing. And Darth Vader, in my opinion, encompasses all that, because you look at it, you can see a little bit of samurai influence. You kind of know culturally that he's a warrior, but then his face, his mask, on top of that is a very stylized human face, and so it's kind of almost like a death mask. But then on top of that, you have the sound effect of the breathing and all of the other elements on there, where you see the little vents in the front of the mask, and you realize, okay, well, no, there's a bigger purpose to the mask. Not only does it look cool and it's a stylized skull, but there's a mechanical purpose. It's actually helping Vader to sustain himself. And so when you put all those things together, it was a perfect marriage of all these pieces to create one of the most visually striking villains of all time.
Back to concept designer Glenn Dillon. The first movie he worked on was Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens. Here, he got to work with costume designer Michael Kaplan, who is known for his work on Fight Club, Armageddon, Blade Runner, and many more.
Working with Michael Kaplan was great. And quite quickly he trusted that I knew I knew the subject matter. I think he wouldn't mind me saying that he's of the Star Trek generation, really. He's an older guy. So that's what he saw on the TV when he was younger. And when I'd done a few drawings and worked with him for a little while, he knew that I knew what I was talking about in terms of Star Wars. But Kylo Ren was a tough nut to crack. It's always a conversation and a dialogue between the director JJ and Michael and myself, and of course then lots of other people have opinions and producers, and so everyone is in on it, and everyone's trying to do the best job that they can. And the character kind of developed over time. At first he didn't have a name; he was just known as the Jedi Killer. So we always referred to him as the Jedi Killer for most of the process. And at the beginning, the character was to be wounded and scarred. So in some way, his suit and mask was in some way assisting him, much in the same way that Darth Vader's was, actually. So I was doing stuff like leg braces. And for a little while, JJ wanted to be able to see some of his face through the mask. So we were kind of toying with the kind of a Phantom of the Opera type thing, but he didn't want Phantom of the Opera, so it was kind of difficult.
Quick side note. Here are two things that you probably already know, since you are most likely a hardcore Star Wars fan listening to this. The character we're talking about here, Kylo Ren, is the son of Han Solo and Princess Leia, the nephew of Luke Skywalker, and the grandson of Darth Vader. They're all one big dysfunctional family. And when he's saying JJ, he's talking about the director of the newer movies, J.J. Abrams. But like I said, you already knew that, right? So let's go back to Glenn Dillon on how he was working with JJ in getting the look of Kylo Ren just perfect.
It's one of those things where we went through lots of things of not really knowing what he wanted. So sometimes he wanted it to feel really horror-like. But then if you were showing images that were more horror-like, it didn't feel right. It was one of these really difficult processes where sometimes the design started to lead the story, because it felt like as the story developed, it was obvious that he was relating to his grandfather in some way. And JJ was very wary from the start of not wanting to do anything too similar to Vader. You want to do something different when you're doing your film. But it felt to me like, well, he is honoring his grandfather. So if it does have some sort of similarity, that would make some sort of sense. So that's where the kind of cowl shape round the back, the first thing that came up didn't have that element round the back, the cowl element round the back. But I added that in, and my argument was that that would be part of him, that he's trying to emulate Vader's look. But one thing JJ said that really clicked with me and was the thing that got me where we were going was he said, I want a kid sitting on the back seat of their mum's car to see a poster, to see this mask, whatever that mask is, and for them to, leap forward and say, Mum, what's that? I want to go and see that. And that got me thinking about, well, what was the stuff that really, really blew my mind when I was a kid? And there's this painter, illustrator called Chris Foss. He did amazing airbrush paintings of these fantastical spaceships. And he did some of the spaceship designs for Jodorowsky's unmade Dune film. But he would do a lot of these like sci-fi book covers with these amazing spaceships of a massive scale, but also of crazy kind of colors. And often it was a black and yellow kind of crazy color scheme. And that inspired me to do those stripes on the forehead that going down into the cheeks of the mask. And when J.G. Foss saw them, he liked that idea. He liked the stripes and he liked that kind of patterning. But he wasn't sure about it being yellow and black. He liked the black, but so he said maybe I think it was his idea there, and he said maybe that could be chrome, because in the first scene he knew that it was going to be all fire and all around. So if it was chrome, it would reflect in the mask and make it look that black and yellow, black and orange.
Unlike his grandfather, Kylo Ren takes off his mask from time to time. Was that part of the plan originally?
Well, no. So the story changed so he wasn't as damaged, because I think at some point in the very early stages there was this idea that he'd maybe had a fight with Luke, and that's why he was injured or damaged in some way. But then the story changed, but they wanted to keep the mask. So the mask came more about intimidating people, intimidation. So that then enabled him to like put it on when he wanted to intimidate him, and to be able to take it off, at will. I think, when JJ gets someone like Adam Driver as the character, he wanted to be able to see his face because he's such a great actor. So It made sense, really.
How much do you think of the actor who's going to be wearing your design when you're creating it?
Well, at first, we didn't know. There's a period of time where you don't know there's no casting had been done. Also, like I said, we only had this Jedi killer as a vague title of the character. But then once you know, then it's like, oh, okay, that's great. And I think you do. It does come into your thought process. Absolutely. He's got an amazing physique. He's a great shape. He's tall, and the way he holds his body, it was really good figure for him to have that mask on. And the costume that Michael designed was great. The way it flowed and it kicked out when he was marching down the corridors and stuff. And there was a time in the fitting, actually, it was really funny, where I was so concentrating on the job, like he was wearing the helmet, and we didn't want like any part of his jaw showing. So he had a high-necked collar, which came right up under his chin. And the mask, I didn't want it in the same way that Vader's kind of is very big and comes right down low. The idea with Kylo Ren was to try and keep it like the sports car version, if you like, something that was more able for him to move. It was so it was a bit smaller and tighter to the head. So I was just looking at it in the profile, not worrying about whether we were going to see any of his jawline. So I was just thinking about maybe adding a little extra piece on the side near his jaw. And as I was just standing there looking, he's standing in the mirror, like he's got the full costume on and the helmet. And he turned to me really quickly, just spun his head at me in this kind of aggressive way to freak me out.
I've been waiting for this day for a long time.
And which, of course, it did. It really worked. So I was completely intimidated by this character.
Your own design scared you. Your own design worked on you.
Yes, exactly.
That's how you know you've done a good job.
Yeah, exactly.
Matthew Wood from Skywalker Sound also worked with Adam Driver and had to create what Kylo would sound like when he was wearing the mask. That part of the sound is not recorded on set. It's something they record in a studio after the filming. Normally, they would record the lines and the sound designers would put the effects on the sound after the recording. But Matthew took a different approach.
Yeah, so Adam Driver, a fantastic actor. Adams very much takes his craft seriously. He's, a Juilliard-trained actor, and he really gets into his roles. And I wanted to match his enthusiasm and intensity in sound. So instead of normally what I do with a mask process, like with C-3PO or a stormtrooper, is I just take the original performance and I layer the mask process on in post-production, and the actor doesn't have anything to do with it. With Kylo, I was like, well, no, I want Adam to hear it while he's doing it. So I wanted to have him be able to play with the microphone and the compression that I was using and the distortion and everything I was doing with his voice from a technical standpoint. I wanted him to be able to perform with. So he came into Bad Robot, and I set the stage, and it was just Adam and I working together one-on-one, and I put him in a very dark room. I closed all the curtains, and then I went and got a Darth Vader mask that was at Bad Robot, and I put it on a pedestal in front of him, and I put a spotlight on that, and I just put him in the room alone with it. And it's to kind of get him in the mood of like, this is, because the character of Kylo Ren is so obsessed with his grandfather, Darth Vader, and so I wanted that to be like kind of influencing Adam's performance, and I just worked with him, and he would say the lines and speak and kind of really get into it. And I was, as he was talking, I was manipulating the compression and distortion in his headphones, which he had on as he's talking, so he was feeling it. And I noticed as the compression went up, his performance got more creepy and small, but then I would blow that up artificially with distortion, and it had this really unsettling feeling.
And I will let nothing stand in our way.
And so we locked in on that, and that's what we decided to use. And so that was a great collaboration, I thought, of like sound design and actors' performance coming together to drive the story of the character forward. So that was really fun for me.
Wow, sound design in real time. And the funny thing is that working with Adam Driver and the voice of Kylo Ren, Matthew became the official sound-alike for Kylo in video games, action figures, and in-person park experiences at Disney. You see, Matthew was also a voice actor, and before working with Kylo, he became the voice of General Grievous, the main antagonist in Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith.
Army or not, you must realize you are doomed.
So something dawned on him as he was working with Adam Driver.
While we were working together for those first few hours, I was realizing at that point that I'm like, wow, General Grievous is now teaching Kylo Ren how to be a creepy villain. Like, he's handing the reins over, which I thought was kind of funny, like in a meta kind of way.
We've been waiting for you. And I will finish what you started.
But Star Wars is so, funny like that. There's all those weird happy accidents, and I'm just happy to blend the technology part of it with the acting part of it, and using both sides of your brain to create story to drive the script,
I'll show you the dark side.
Glenn, can you tell me a bit more about the design of a character like Kylo Ren? Like, how many iterations does it have before ending up with what we see on the screen?
Oh, there's loads, because you are up against, like we said, the most iconic villain in cinema history, Darth Vader. You're trying to do something, you're trying to land on something that is different, hopefully as good as, but something that's different and for a new generation. So it was a really difficult process. So it wasn't just me who was working on it. In the end, we pulled in the talents from the creature department and the art department, and everyone was having a go at it. So I did however many hundreds of ideas. But it got down. We were, getting nearer the finish line where we need to have something that we need to make in order to get it done in time to start filming. And I was working on something else, but I knew that JJ was coming for a meeting that afternoon, and I had an idea for this Chris Foss kind of exploration. So I quickly kind of did a batch of drawings, images, and showed them to Michael, and he's like, yeah, great, let's put them into the meeting as well. And that was one of them that he liked. And it was probably about a year, nearly a year of working on this and working on lots of other stuff as well, but
Wow.
of trying to get to that point. So when JJ said, I like that, it was just like, yes, thank God.
Wow, to see your imagination come to life like that, it must just be...
It's incredible.
Yeah.
That was my favorite thing about all of these years working on the Star Wars films. So once JJ had kind of okayed the direction for Kylo's helmet, then we had to kind of work on making it up in 3 dimensions. And when it comes to that, there's this amazing guy called Sam Williams who works in ZBrush, which is a computer program, which is like a sculpting program. So you can sculpt inside the computer.
Wow.
It's kind of like playing with clay inside the computer. And he's very kind. He didn't mind me sitting next to him all the time, asking him to pull it and push it and tweak it here and there. Yeah, it's the best thing about these films is like working at people who are the best in the world at their jobs, So you draw something or design something, think something up, and it can sometimes be only a few days later that they're producing something that looks amazing. And
Wow.
it's a real treat, it's a real pleasure and honor to be involved with those people.
No kidding. Is there a specific scene you can tell us about in the film that you're really pleased with?
Well, I think I think Adams, he's amazing what he does with it, and yeah, I mean, I loved seeing him storming through the corridors. I like those low angles that JJ did when he's storming through the corridors. There's a scene where, for those of you who will look closely, where when he's interrogating Poe, that was the first day of shooting. So it was the first thing we shot with Kylo Ren, and the original helmet design, the muzzle or the face plate that's on the mask was bigger. We designed it as a bigger thing, and in that scene you see it. But I think when the rushes went off to America, I think someone higher up requested that muzzle plate be reduced. So it was a bit of a kind of panic stations. Okay, quick, we have to do, and we cut it down to maybe 2 different sizes. Showed JJ, he chose one, and that was what it became for the rest of the film. And he said, they'd fix that in post, but they never did. So if you want to see what it was originally designed like, you can see in that scene when he's in The Force Awakens, when he's interrogating Poe, that was how it was originally designed. Had we known that earlier, I would have moved that dent over, but of course it was too late. So for me, that little dent is a little bit too close to the edge of that face mask, but I have to get used to that.
Let's bring in the 2 Lego designers that created the 3 Siths in Lego art. Senior designer Kit Kosman and design lead Christopher Stamp. Now, Lego art is 2-dimensional, which I imagine is different than what you're used to designing. How did that affect the process of creating it?
When we created this, it's I've been painting paintings before, and I really had to use that knowledge that I gained doing paintings when I did these ones, because it is flat images and you're working with colors. And the thing about mosaics is that you have to step away from them to actually really see what they are. When you're too close up to them, like it sometimes just look like a ocean of colors. So I think the magic about them is that when you move a bit away from them, you can suddenly see what it is, and that is a bit like painting. So I really used my painting skills when I did these mosaics, but it's a very different experience compared to what I've been doing so far. But I knew it from back then. So in that respect, like it was nice doing something different and getting back to that media again.
I think when I first looked at it, I thought, oh, this will be, pretty simple. It's very lines of studs, very 2D, like you mentioned. Because I was a little bit naive as to the complexities it takes to create art. I think that's the biggest difference between Lego art and other Lego products, is that it's more art than design. You need to look at it the way you would look at a painting in a gallery rather than necessarily the way you would look at a sculpture. That's pretty strange just to when you step into it, when you're trying to design it from a mindset standpoint. I was very lucky because Kit was on the team and Kit's got experience with art and painting previously. I think that the challenge that I noticed was you kind of, with most Lego products, you think about the play experience, but then that goes hand in hand with the building experience. And the two is kind of 50-50. You need to have fun when you're building it, and then you need to have fun when you're playing with it. But with this, the building experience to some extent takes a lesser seat. And because you're focusing more on the adults and it's a display piece rather than a toy, the visual aspect and that final visual display piece, that takes a very much greater role. So you don't need to necessarily build in hidden functions and features. The build of it's going to be placing a lot of 1x1 round plates in a row. That kind of takes care of itself. We found that to make that interesting, that was how we used the colors. So, for example, you'll see on some of them that we don't have just a plain background. We tried to mix, maybe include dark blue and black in a pattern to make that build a bit interesting, so you don't feel it's repetitive, just placing the same color constantly. But it was more the use of how we use the colors together to give it that 3D look. So even though you're building something that's very 2D and flat, when you look at the individual images, when you look at that, then it's very 3D effect. That's the change, I think. That was the struggle I found, because when you build a normal Lego model, it's automatically 3D.
Let's talk about now Star Wars, the 3 different Siths that you're able to create in Lego art. The most iconic of them all, Darth Vader. What was that experience like?
With Star Wars, we worked we created brand new art directly with Lucasfilm. Characters we have seen, but art and imagery that's never been shown in a poster or in a movie or anything. So that was a very different experience with this product, because we went into this with an idea of what we wanted, but it was a really close dialogue with the concept artists at Lucasfilm to figure out what is the right pose, where should the lighting be, should the lighting be more intense, less intense, what should the cropping on that picture be. So compared to some of the others that we worked with, this one was very different as well, and definitely a different learning curve.
Yeah, also I think the images were very special compared to what we've been working with in the other mosaics, because the contrast between the light and the darkness was so big. So when creating them, that was a big challenge to actually get that light right. That took some time, and also like the with Darth Maul, like half of his face was from the original image. It was more or less in just like really, really dark. And to create that difference between the light side and the dark side, it sounds really like Star Wars now, doesn't it? With just 12 colors, that was sometimes a bit hard. Particularly with Darth Maul, we struggled a lot because his eyes just like didn't want to show up on the image. we did several like tryouts on him before we got his eye right, because in the beginning it was just like one yellow dot, and they looked really scary. But we made a tighter crop on him, and then at some point we found his eyes again.
And what about the Kylo Ren piece?
I think the thing with Kylo Ren, the challenge we had there was because we are reusing the same colors throughout the 3 pictures. The question with Kylo Ren was, how do we increase the amount of red? Following on from Darth Maul, who has a lot of red in the skin tone, and then with Darth Vader, you can put a lot of red into the eyes, particularly. Kylo Ren, you don't really do that. Then you're kind of going away from who the character truly is. But what we were allowed to do is we could work closely with the people working on the new movie at the time, which was the Last Jedi. And from that, we found out that Kylo Ren was going to have the new look with the red streaks and cracks through his helmet. So we were given that information quite early, which was before the movie came out, which was great. And that really helped us, because before that we kept trying different things and different amounts of reflection on the helmet, which was one solution, but wasn't really creating the character the way that we know him.
Also, the challenge with him was actually that he has these stripes going around his eyes and his helmet that's made out of like silvery metal, and to just create this gap around like between the stripes was hard to get that right on the image, and also to get the shape of this mouse piece right. That was also a bit of a hassle. So, but I think like the hardest one was actually Darth Vader, to make him be, like to get all the shape of his helmet right.
Yeah,
that took some effort, and also his eyes, to get the shine in his eyes. That was also really hard.
Yeah, and we also found, because I remember when we first started with Darth Vader, I think he was the first one we started with, because obviously this was new for us. We explored how detailed do these need to be. We wanted these to be quite photorealistic. obviously because it's pixel, you need to simplify. But we tried simplifying it to begin with, and it looked very cartoonish. And that's why we needed to really figure out the balance of how simple do we make this. Because if you make it too simple, it looks kind of like a hand-drawn, like a very down in age version of the character.
It's almost like a comic book.
Exactly. So we really wanted to capture, for example, the lines on his chin in the mask, and the lines and the reflections on his cheek. That took a lot of time, and then that had a domino effect onto the cropping. Because if we can't get it, then we need to scale it up a little bit more to get that to allow us to have the pixels to capture the highlights and shadows.
Yeah. So I guess cropping and how you're going to crop the photo is a huge part of all of this too, when you're determining what will be the most manageable to recreate in Lego art form.
Absolutely.
So the lightsaber is in all three pictures. Was that a given that you wanted to make sure that was an element in each one?
Yeah, that was a specific request that I asked the artists to put in. When you think of Star Wars, I mean, I'm a fan of Star Wars myself, but when you think of Star Wars, one of the first things that pops into your head is lightsabers. That's one of the coolest parts of it. So there was the need that, okay, if you're showing these characters, when are they at the coolest? They're at the coolest when they're doing lightsaber fights. But then from a practicality standpoint, it kind of answered the question of Darth Maul is red and the other characters are black and silvery and dark gray. How do we get the red into the other pictures? How do we make these three? If you're a collector and you build all three and you put them all on your wall at the same time, how do you get the three to work together as a one piece? So therefore, by including that red lightsaber in the three images, that really pulled the images together, and it dialed up the use of red that we could have through Darth Vader and Kylo Ren to match Darth Maul.
So you chose to do the Sith Lords in this, so the bad guys. Why did you choose to portrait the dark side and not the good guys?
We started with Darth Vader. When you think of Star Wars and you think of the three trilogies, it's realistically Darth Vader is the main character. He is kind of to some extent the hero of the whole story. If you go to the prequel trilogy, it's a story of him going from a boy into becoming Darth Vader as a man. And then obviously the original trilogy is all about Darth Vader and his connection with Luke. And then in the sequel trilogy, it's very much about Kylo Ren trying to live up to and trying to match Darth Vader. So when you look at the Skywalker saga, it's very much a story of Darth Vader. So we started with that perspective. And then from that, we went into how do we make this as a three-piece work? What is the cool story we could tell around it? And the coolest aspect of Darth Vader or Anakin Skywalker is when he's in the Darth Vader phase of his life. So from that, we then quickly lent into the dark side of the Force and into the Sith Lords.
With Star Wars, it's quite unique that the bad guys are just as popular, if not more so, than the good guys. Let's go around the table with this one. Let's start with you, Ian. Why do you think it's like that?
I think it's because we like characters that are rich in contrast and paradoxes because they feel fully rounded, they feel real. And because the good guys have to walk such a fine line in a story and people back off from having them do anything that might lose the audience sympathy, the bad guys have the stage and they can do anything they want, right? So they can be really nice. They could be great. They can have a favorite pet. They can actually be good guys with this one flaw, with this fatal flaw that does not let them follow through on the good. And so as a result, they tend to be much more interesting. And very often when I'm writing stories, because I do that too, I will take my villains and swap them with the good guys. Oh. And all the characteristics of the villain now become the good. I do that in designs as well. You know, it's very easy to put horns and teeth and spikes on something and make it feel evil. But then If you swap it for the good guys, you've got Batman.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And very often you can do the same trick with the evil people too. Evil tends to shout, tends to be nice and loud and dominate the stage, but evil that's quiet, evil that you don't know is there, like Kyber Soze from The Usual Suspects, are terrifying. And so if you really, really wanted to do evil, make him the most unremarkable, law-abiding citizen you possibly can who does these terrible things.
Christopher?
I think the best heroes, I feel, are defined by their villains. So if you look at Batman and the Joker, for example, you can have a good hero, but they're only really as good as what the bad guy is. And I think when you look at Star Wars, Darth Vader is arguably the biggest bad guy in movie history. Everybody quotes those movies. Everybody knows who Darth Vader is, whether you're a small child or you're an adult. And he's kind of timeless. So I think that alone is added to how cool he is as a character. And then with the introduction of Darth Maul, he could take on two Jedis at the same time and kind of win. So he's even cooler from that standpoint because you need two good guys to take on this bad guy. And then when you're looking at Kylo Ren, he's even pushing it a bit further, where he's taking on the whole empire to some extent. So if the bad guy isn't a challenge for the good guy, then they're kind of not as cool. But the fact that these are really powerful and it takes everything the hero has to beat them, I think that automatically puts them off on a certain level, in my opinion.
Yeah. Glenn, what's your take?
I mean, for me, I think when I was a kid, I loved the first film, and I think the most intriguing thing and the thing that really hooked me in was everything about the Force. I loved that whole idea, and I don't know, maybe that's why it's so popular. I think when you're a kid, you're closer to that kind of idea of things. You're closer to that magic in life, and I think there's that Jungian shadow self idea. That there's the part of us that is that is the dark part. So I think it's a safe way somehow of looking at that stuff and accepting it in films like this. It's like, going on a roller coaster. It's a safe way of putting your life in danger, knowing you're going to come out okay. It's a safe way of looking at that dark part of yourself without really putting yourself in any danger.
What about you, Matthew? Why do you think the Sith are so popular?
Because I think that, bad guys are usually misguided. They're very close to being good guys, but just what they've allied themselves with is just not the right cause usually, and you need to have something. I mean, it's always the battle of good versus evil. So good's got to have something to battle every once in a while. But the bad guys are usually tormented by something or obsessed with something, and their ego gets involved too. So usually they're quite flashy and self-important, and I think that just makes them larger than life. And you got to have the good forces out there to sort of calm that all down. But I think everyone inside of us we all have things that we wrestle with, good and bad. So I think it's just a moment. It's a way to see that bad side personified on screen in a way that you'd never do yourself. But it's interesting to watch to see how that would transpire, and it's great to see good come in and vanquish evil always. I find. And
I guess it's just fun. Actors always say it's the most fun to play a villain, and to let that part of yourself go, let it run free. It's interesting.
Is it more fun to design a villain?
Yes. Yes, definitely. I think all of the Empire stuff is really fun to design. Yeah, all the stormtroopers. I love designing all the stormtroopers. That's definitely my favorite part of the job, I think.
But really, there's heaven and there's hell. But in reality, we embody both. We have both urges, both desires inside of us. And it's important to be able to see the dark inside you and not turn it into an external monster, right? Something that's out there that I can just pick up a lightsaber and defeat. And that's the great thing about Star Wars is it's full of complex characters like that. Luke becomes the hero because he throws a lightsaber down and says, "No, I won't kill my father." And Darth Vader becomes interesting because he saves his son. What do you do when someone horrible does a good moment? And that fascinates me too. Is there a way out of hell? Is there a way of redemption for a character, good or evil?
Thank you for listening to the story behind Star Wars and the Sith. How's your piece of art coming along? Are you getting ready to hang it on the wall? Maybe you're ready to break it apart and build one of the other versions, or create your own. In this soundtrack, we've been talking so much about creativity. So we'll end with Ian McCaig, talking about how we can all foster creativity in our kids.
I think by doing it with them, right? If anybody wants their kids to grow up to be artists, pick up a piece of paper, do a goofy drawing, pass it over to them, and have them add something to it. Or, when they go to bed at night, tell them to give you a creature and a food and a place. And rather than reading a bedtime story, tell them one. And tell them if you miss any one of those 3 things, they get another story. So man, do they listen carefully. Woo! Right? But then you practice your storytelling skills. And you'll start to run out because you'll use up every story you've ever read, adapted into your own stories, and then you have to start telling stories about you thinly disguised. And those are the ones the kids most want to hear.
This has been an original soundtrack from Lego Art. My name's Andrea Collins. Thank you for listening. May the Force be with you.